So, in our last video, we talked about trauma, what it is and the nature of it. So it makes sense that the next video would be the extrapolation of that, or the further continuation of how that would play out. Or in other words, intergenerational trauma, or trauma on the scale of society at large. So to recap, trauma is essentially an experience that is too powerful for the nervous system to handle, so it shuts down and represses it to the subconscious or unconscious, which is another separate dynamic of the human psyche. I, the individual, is, the one that identifies as the individual, is not the only entity within the psyche of Andre Pontes. This is just the conscious aspect of Andre Pontes. So it gets suppressed into the subconscious to be dealt with at a later date when we have the skill set or tool set developed to deal with it. Trauma behaves like a virus. When we think of a virus, it is a repeating behavior mechanism. You get sick and then you sneeze on someone, and then that virus, that little it could be argued that viruses aren't even living organisms because they don't fit the criteria that we have for an organism. They don't feed, they don't reproduce, they don't need to have resources. They just replicate themselves. They invade cells, zip up with their DNA or their RNA, I forget which, and then just rewrite the DNA so it just keeps repeating. It's just a mindless repetition. It's more code than an organism. It's just automatic repetition. Trauma behaves in the same way when we think of it on a functional, mechanistic level of what's actually happening. Not to discredit anything else besides that and to say that's the whole experience, but when we get down to the bare bones, that is certainly a large part of the experience. So we can think of as when you sneeze on someone, you spread the virus, right? The malady of the virus. So in in psychological terms or emotional terms, when you lash out, or when you get triggered, or when an individual gets triggered and they react that way, they're essentially sneezing on the other person with their trauma, and they're infecting them with their trauma, and the trauma repeats itself. I've come across a lot of examples or situations in society when it comes to do with the nature of structure, of societal structure within organizations, specifically school and employment, but not necessarily the only ones. They're just the most common in modern human society. And where if I didn't behave a certain way, I was being disrespectful. And we see this, especially in school, when kids don't behave and don't conform to the expectations of the older crowd, of their elders, they're being disrespectful. Now, this can be true sometimes. They're laughing at a funeral is a terrible idea. If there is a child who doesn't understand that this is not the place to be laughing and playing around, yes, they need that instruction. However, there are many cases where this is not the case. I remember watching a video, I forget who said it, but they made a very incredible point where we punish children for being happy, and then we congratulate them for being sad. If they're sad, then they get taken care of. Oh, you're feeling bad? Oh, it's okay. But when they're happy, we're like, why are you so loud? What are you being what's so funny? What are you being so silly? Stop doing that. It's noisy. You're going to bother the neighbors. We're teaching them to be ashamed of their joy, which is horrifying. So then, in the structural sense, in the educational sense, it's, they're not behaving like me, like what I had to go through, which means that they're being disrespectful. So I am a loud and gregarious person, and as a child, very rambunctious. I was a class clown and enjoyed performing and being expressive, and this was seen as disrespectful. And I was, especially with teachers, so I had a British education and upbringing, so it was seen as, not upbringing, education, so it was seen as, he's loud, so he's disrespectful. He's making jokes, so he's disrespectful. He's not taking this serious. I wasn't making jokes because I wanted to be disrespectful. I was making jokes or to humiliate anyone or make fun of anyone. I was making jokes because I liked making people laugh. I liked making people happy. But it wasn't seen that way. And a lot of the trauma comes, and a lot of the experience I've realized over the years. And there's always when questioning this situation, well, why is this happening? And if I were to confront people about it, it's like, well, because that's the way it's always been. That's what I had to go through, you know? And you see this behavior play out, especially between the generations of older generations to younger, is this is what I had to go through, so you have to go through it too. What this ultimately comes down to is the nature, and I'm going to be more specific in just, you know, the concept of trauma, the nature of fear and anxiety, or more accurately, insecurity. Insecurity is when an organism doesn't feel safe, you know? Security, you're safe. Insecurity, you're unsafe. So when an organism feels unsafe, they need their reality to mirror them. And a part of that is they need to control their reality in order to mirror them. Because if it mirrors them, you know, you see this with babies. They need you to mirror them so that they can feel safe. And the idea that babies are solipsists, they don't know that the rest of the world exists, and that when they do experience that first encounter of like, oh, I'm separate from the rest of the world, I'm separate from the world around me, then it becomes a threat to them. You know, knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, I don't, you know, oh, I'm scared of what's separate. So ultimately, the process of a baby becoming a child is accepting that reality is separate from you and that you don't control it. Because when you're a baby, you laugh, you cry, you get what you want, right? So you control reality. And you need to believe this at this level, at this nervous system level. And the part of the growth process, you know, that's useful at that point. And then what becomes more useful is the acceptance, the realization and acceptance that the world around you is not in your control, is separate from you. Now, that is terrifying because you're also aware of yourself. It's like, oh, if I'm not that, then what am I? I'm just a baby and I'm useless. I can't protect myself. This is terrifying. I know, let me pretend that that's not happening. I need to believe this isn't happening. I will do everything in my power to make sure that this doesn't happen, and anyone who tells me otherwise, I'm going to suppress and control. And then when you do have a certain level of control, you know, which children have, and then grab agency, it's about, let me stop anything from from making me confront the painful feeling that I'm having. You know, this is the behavior, what's going on. So let me, you know, so and you'll see this with kids. It's like, oh, if I'm not allowed to have this, you're not allowed to have this, right? And that's a large part of this behavior, is people who do not feel safe within their own nervous system, their own sense of self, their own separation, need to force that on the world around them for two reasons. One, there's still the baby thing of, oh, if I cry, then people will help me, and I want people to help me and make me feel safe, which is what should happen to a baby and a child. And then ultimately, if I don't get that, if I don't get of like me feeling safe, you know, then no one else should get it either. One reason is, if I don't get it, then they don't get it too, because if they do get it, then that makes me more aware of my lack of having the thing, which makes me even more scared and horrified and in pain, and I don't want to feel pain, so I'm going to do anything in my power to distract myself from what I'm feeling, including alter my perception of reality, alter my understanding of what the situation. No, I'm not lacking. They're the problem. I'm not the problem. They're the problem. I'm going to go correct them, you know? What all of this has to do is with suppressing and distracting the feeling of pain, the feeling of fear, the acceptance of separation. Because ultimately what this comes down, all fear, as I've mentioned previously in other videos, is the fear of death. So when we're confronted with our separateness from reality itself, not just from the people around us, not just from, you know, oh my care, you know, that person is not me, that's my mother or father, that's my caregiver, and they're a separate self, which means they can't, you know, I can't control them, which means that I can't always get what I want if I can't control the person who's responsible for giving, you know, for taking care of me. So all of this, the separation, the awareness of self implies the awareness of the death of self. If I am a self, then I can also die, then I can also end. So when our first encounter with the experience, with the awareness of, oh, I am a self, is also synonymous, simultaneously conjoined with the awareness of that self can die. And that is a horrifying, terrible experience, but an experience that one must go through and one has to go through in order to move on, in order to grow and develop fully and experience, become the person or the organism one is meant to be. This is the rite of passage in many cultures, and this is ultimately the goal of that. You have to die in order to be reborn into something new. You have to die as a child to be reborn as an adult. It's not just in this specific from child to adult. It's in many cases, like marriage is also a rite of passage. You have to die as an individual to be reborn as a couple, as a marriage. You're no longer a single entity. You have to, and then when you childbirth, the birth of your first child, you have to die as an adult with wants and needs, even within a marriage. You have to die as a marriage to become part of a family. You have to, to be reborn as a family. I would have to die as an individual man who always puts himself first and his needs first, even with a partner sometimes, to be reborn as a father and parenting. The whole point of parenting is sacrifice, not to an unhealthy extent and the fact that you don't get to exist anymore, but there is a primordial level of like, oh, now that I have a child, it's not about me anymore. Now, this is the change one has to make. And also this has to be a voluntary and a self-aware change. That's how you transform. It can't just be forced upon you. It is in some cases, and then we have to accept. But even then, it's I have to choose to accept this situation I'm in. And when this doesn't happen, when the individual organism does not accept the situation of their reality, that they are separate, that they are a self, and that self can die, what ends up happening is insecurity. What ends up happening is fear. Fear is not there to punish us, fear is there to teach us. And the way it teaches us is by feeling it. We have to accept that the feeling is happening. When you are feeling afraid because you will die and you don't distract from that and you don't run away from it and you don't change it, you don't try to think, oh, if I'm feeling this, then that means I have to do this, or if I'm feeling this, it means that, or I am this. None of that. It's just feeling, just sitting in the uncomfortableness in a safe setting, sitting in the uncomfortableness and letting it wash through your nervous system, feeling what's happening in your body, feeling what's changing, and just being present with it. When you have that experience, what you're ultimately doing is accepting reality itself as it is. And you're transforming yourself in that moment. Anything other than that, anything other than sitting with the emotion, sitting with the pain of it, is distraction. It doesn't matter how pretty the distraction is. It doesn't even matter how meaningful, although there's an argument to be said for that. We've created art, philosophy, and our distractions from our mortality. And these are useful and beneficial things, but ultimately we gotta go home. At the end of the day, we gotta go home and we gotta accept that fact, no matter what we think, because only then can we move on. Only when we understand what death is do we understand what life is. Can we appreciate it? Can we experience it fully and have a connection to it, Without that, we're always working with blinders, like, no, I don't want to see it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to deal with it, no. The only thing that matters is my fantasy, and if you try to invade my fantasy with reality or your fantasy, and you push me too far, I'm going to push back, and I'm going to make my fantasy your fantasy. And thus we get to the dictatorship mentality. Oh, I'm in pain, and it's their fault, and I'm going to do something about it, And the idea is that this behavior starts in this age, that if a person doesn't have a fully developed or healthy transition phase into being a self, being separate from the unity experience, which is, in the womb, then what ends up happening is that organism, that individual spends, because they don't accept their separation, because they don't accept death, they don't accept the mortality, they spend the rest of their life in every single aspect of they do trying to control reality itself, trying to dominate reality itself, and trying to make their fantasy, their experience, everyone else's experience. Because in this situation of, no, I'm in control of my reality, we have ultimately a delusion, but because of fantasy, a falsity, and because it's false, it doesn't exist and it never could. And fantasies are threatened by truth, because truth is the only thing that exists. Reality is the only thing that exists. And it only takes like a millimeter of truth to destroy the most beautiful constructed fantasy. So for an organism that's stuck in delusion, stuck in the need of, I need to control everything, otherwise I'm gonna die, or I need to control everything, otherwise I'm gonna feel terrified, and that's very painful, then just the smallest modicum of truth is a threat to them. So they need to, so this is why it's not enough for me to feel this way and believe this way. I need everyone else to feel this way and believe this way. Going back to human society and human civilization in general, and purposely being more specific about it, we see this play out in various dictatorships. You can see this throughout various cultures, throughout time, throughout history, throughout geography, and they're all very different. They all play out in different, the cultures, the languages, the mentalities even. But at its core of all of this is the idea, my way over everything else. Not everyone else, because it's not even just the people, it's the rocks and the mountains and the sky has to conform to my expectations of reality. Because if it doesn't, if one thing disagrees with me, if one little thing's out of place, I will feel threatened. I will be threatened, and it will remind me of the ever yawning, void reaching for me, and being like, remember your death, memento mori. Boom, boom, and boom. Because that is the ultimate truth of all things. It can never be denied, no matter how hard you distract from it. You could take over the galaxy itself. You still will die one day. So food for thought, dictators. This reminds me a lot of, since I'm wearing the sigil, this reminds me a lot of Darkseid and his fascination with the anti-life equation. For those who don't know, Darkseid is an awesome bad guy in the Superman storyline, and one of my favorite bad guys. Just for how cunning and convoluted his schemes and plots this is a person who's physically stronger than Superman, who could lay waste with him whenever he wants, but he doesn't, because he's not interested. And there's a little arrogance to it of like, no, I'm gonna beat him with intellect and my greatness of being a god, and that whole megalomaniac thing. But ultimately, Darkseid's goal is the anti-life equation. I have no idea what the hell that means, but my guess is that the anti-life equation is something that allows him to control all life by negating it ultimately. So I guess the guy's suicidal, or he just wants to make a reverse universe. Anyways, my point is, this is a being who has control of their planet, ultimate control of his planet. He's so powerful, he's already conquered his planet, and he has sights on the rest of the universe, because if anything exists out there that isn't Darkseid or has the face of Darkseid on it, he's going to obliterate. It's a threat to him. He wants it. He needs it. He must have it, for I am Darkseid and I get it whatever I want, right? But then what happens? What happens when he gets what he wants? When he gets all of the universe in his image? Well, the anti-life equation resets life, so like death, he ultimately dies. So in and we're going away from Darkseid now. In the want to protect yourself from the fear of death, you end up killing yourself and everything else. And what I akin this to is cancer. So my knowledge of the biology of cancer and tumors is very limited, so forgive me for making a bunch of mistakes that I'm about to make. But for the sake of poetry, it's a poetic argument, I'll say that. Cancer ultimately is a rogue cell, right? A rogue cell goes, oh, fuck! None of these people are like me. I'm going to take control. I'm going to take over. I'm a eukaryotic skin cell, but whatever. I should run this thing. I think I can do better. And starts turning and metastasizing all the other cells around it and forms a tumor. But what is the end result? The tumor ends up killing the host and the tumor itself. So, this idea of like, oh, I have to control things because my way is better, and if I don't control things, I will die, ends up in death anyways, because life is diversity. You need complexity in order for life to exist. It is the complexity and the differences of the different nodes within the system that allows the system to be resilient against catastrophes that could otherwise wipe it out. So that's the logical fallacy of the insecurity, the dictator mentality, that if everything isn't like me, then I will die. Well, no, you will die if everything is like you. A heart attack happens not when the heartbeat beats too irregularly and it goes and goes random. It happens when a heartbeat is too in sync and too orderly and homogeneous. Because what happens is the heartbeat never beats on the same exact way twice. It's chaotic in this nature, and this discrepancy in timing, not all the cells beat at the same time. So when the heart beats and some of the cells beat differently, that difference, that like noise, as you might call it, that discrepancy kind of feeds it to go forward. So it's a system kind of constantly correcting itself, but because it's constantly correcting itself and rebalancing, it's what keeps it moving. So if your heart was literally orderly, you die. So there, another argument for chaos. So how does that play into generations? Well, it makes me think of going back to our education system. I constantly wonder, we have this notion in our society of yelling at ignorant people and being upset with ignorant people. That if somebody doesn't know something, I have a right to hurt them. I have a right to humiliate them. I have a right to make fun of them. I have a right to shame them. Shame is the big one. I have the right to make them guilty because, they should know better. I was like, well, it doesn't matter if they should or they shouldn't. They just don't, Like, children aren't ignorant because they choose to be ignorant. They're ignorant because they just are. They just got here. They don't have access to the information because they never had the opportunity to have access to information. They're supposed to be ignorant. They're children. That is the point of a child. And the older generations are supposed to teach them, not reprimand them for not knowing things that they could never know, that an adult knows. They're like, well, I know. Why don't they know it? Now, here we have the repetition of trauma, the repetition of the virus, right? The viral behavior of, I'm like this, so they have to be. I went through this, so they also have to go through it. You have the hazing mentality of like, well, I went through this, so they have to go through it too. The hazing mentality, what it really is a distraction. Is I don't want to face what I'm feeling, so instead of doing that, I'm going to project it outwards. I'm going to make everybody else do it too, because that makes it normal. If I make everyone else suffer this and share this trauma with me, it normalizes it, and it means I am not traumatized. I'm normal. So it doesn't matter if I feel, and it alleviates the suffering a little on a surface level. So that's ultimately the goal of that behavior and why that's happening. It's all about the distraction of the pain, of the trauma. It's like, I'm not feeling this, they're feeling this, the projection outwards. When the only solution is really to go inward and accept that, no, I am feeling this, that did happen. Which is painful, extremely painful and terrifying. Especially if we don't live in a society or context that teaches us what this is, which we haven't. It's changing nowadays, but we haven't. So I see this a lot with our education system, but also, on TV, our artwork, our especially especially in regards to comedy and TV shows and fictional shows, people getting mad at each other for the ignorance of the other person. I had to go through this, so now they have to go through it too. It's like, well, no, they don't have to go through it because you should have never gone through it, and it's a tragedy that you went through it, and I apologize, but ultimately, that's not healthy. When dealing with this and when confronting it and asking, well, why is this the case? The argument we're constantly confronted with is like, it's for the greater good. Which is another way of saying, I don't know, but I'm not going to allow you to talk about it. But let's play this out. The idea that, at the end of the day, this all cancels out to be rational. This all cancels out to be for the benefit of our community, to be the benefit of our collective whole. It is a collective good. And that's completely not true. Because if we genuinely think about the collective good, then we have to think on a logical, functional level of like, well, what does that mean, the collective good? Collective good means the survivability of not just a society, but a collective of societies, and not just human societies, but the whole. In short, planet Earth itself, a living, breathing organism with sub-organisms within it that make it up. Just in the same way that our cells are individual organisms that make us up, we are individual organisms, and our societies and cultures and ecosystems are individual organisms that make up planet Earth, an actual living, breathing organism in and of itself. And when our organs fight each other, we die. When planet Earth's organisms fight each other, planet Earth dies. So if we're really genuinely interested in the good of the whole, in the good of survivability, and remember, cooperation leads to survivability, not competition. Competition is necessary in certain regards because it cuts out the fat and cuts out the dead matter, but ultimately cooperation is what brings things together and allows things to breathe and grow. So if we are genuinely interested in the greater good, then we're talking about survivability, and cooperation is survivability, and cooperation is both ways. And that does not happen in our current model. The state of the world is, like, I could point the camera out the window and see the smog covering the city. That's like the only evidence you would need. Oh, this isn't working because this literally the sky dying. So that argument goes out the window. Well, it's not for the greater good. So then why are you behaving this way? Oh, well, because it's what's right, because it's what's proper. Well, in a lot of this kind of understanding, I'm not against tradition and things as they are. Some things should be kept whole and continued. There's a reason for that. When the tradition erodes the growth of the society, the tradition negates the very reason of its own existence. Traditions are there to maintain society, not erode it. And people are the society, so if it erodes people by saying like, oh, some people are accepted but some others aren't, that's a unhealthy tradition, or a tradition that's outlived its usefulness and is now going against the reason it was started to begin with. The survivability of the whole. So what the real reason for said behaviors is because that's what the older generation experienced as trauma, but they are unable to accept it as trauma, either due to lack of access or because it's just simply too freaking painful to accept, which is understandable. They then need to convince themselves that it's not trauma, it's tradition, and will regurgitate that onto the younger generations to make sure that they don't have to be wrong, that they don't have to confront their fatality, their morality. They have to regurgitate onto younger generations to make sure that they don't come face to face with themselves and their errors. Now, how does one do that? Or in other words, when we come from a place of I need to control everything, how does an individual or society go about trying to control everything? It's actually quite simple. You teach people that the trauma is normal. You teach them that it is expected. In fact, you traumatize them at such a young age that they don't even know they're traumatized to begin with. It's just the water they're swimming in since day one. And not to criticize the education system as a whole, there's a lot of good things. It is a complicated and nuanced subject matter. It's not either or. But this is why a lot of the educational models are the way they are. To explain that, we need to explain something even simpler. Because I think about the behaviors that I have been traumatized with. And where do they come from? Oh, well, they come from my parents' generation. Well, why did my parents have this trauma? Oh, well, because their grandparents treated them this way. Well, why did my grandparents were treated? Oh, they're, so forth and so on. It is a virus regurgitating itself through the generations. There is no greater good or reason why this is happening. It's just mindless trauma throughout the ages, and nobody understands why. They're just too scared and just want it to stop. But nobody knows how to stop it. So they just keep going. They just keep doing it because it's too painful to stop and acknowledge what's happening. Our generation is doing that now. Yes. Thank you. A large part of this has to do with the military. Because I think about, I come from a Brazilian American background, and I think of those two cultures specifically when I think about this stuff. Also Europe, because I had a British education. So those are forefront of my mind. But similar in the Eastern and Southern Middle Eastern hemispheres, a lot of similarities. Ultimately, a human culture thing at large. But, so I think from my perspective, why did these happen? Well, the cultures that I come from, the cultures I was born out of, and the cultures that my parents were born out of, at some point or another, were dictatorships. There were a lot of dictatorships. Even in the US, the people who came here slaughtered a bunch of people, and also the people who came here were fleeing dictatorships. And the way a dictatorship starts is do what I said because I said so, and don't you dare question me. Because if you question me, I will hurt you and even kill you. There is no negotiation. There is no opinion besides me, the commanding officer, and you do what you're told. And we see this in the army, right? The phrase is, and not to criticize all of the army, because it does good and useful things at a certain point. I do not have an expertise in this, so I can't say that. But this specific behavior, this specific instance, is an unhealthy one that I am critiquing, which is we break people down to build them up. Now, what that is saying is that, we purposely traumatize people to the point of just being a raw nervous system. So they do what I tell them to do without question. Now, to a certain point, that is a good thing, because if you are in the middle of nowhere and you're being fired at, and everybody's sitting around questioning like, well, why should I do what you want to do, and no one has a trained background of like what we need to do to solve this problem so we don't freaking die, that's a useful thing to go through. However, that needs to be voluntary and consensual. Like, no one is getting a full breakdown of, oh, what's psychologically going to happen to you when you go sign up in the army, and this is why, and these are those, implications, and what's going to happen to you after you leave the army with the psychological programming. So ultimately what happens is you're traumatizing an entire generation of people with the idea, do what I said because I said so, and don't you dare question me. This is how they were raised. And when they left the army, and we left, we need to consider. So me, 32 now. So my grandparents and great grandparents, these are generations that went through World War I, World War II, and a Great Depression. Like, one of those things is awful beyond belief, like incomprehensibly terrible. Just one of those things. So with that whole mindset, the result of that is that being alive is a blessing, and you should just be grateful that you're alive, Like, we had nothing. I had to live off a slice of bologna for like a year, kind of thing. That's an exaggeration, you get what my point. And so it's understandable that when they had kids, not only was that trauma very still real in their mind, and that's all they could be. And remember, what trauma does is it makes you an automatic creature. It's so painful that you're just constantly going. You're not thinking. You're just moving. So the fact that, that your children have homes that aren't bombed or shot through and have food on their plate is so far beyond what you had. So, yeah, and, and they're ungrateful. There's a lot there that I do not have the time or expertise to go into, so I'm not going to touch that today. But, the idea is that if that's the mentality we're coming from, cycled through the generations, then our parents are constantly guilty for a reason they don't understand or even aware of, and there's like, oh, that's just the way of things. That's proper. That's respectful. That's tradition. To honor, it's in honor of the sacrifice that the other generations made before. But then what ends up happening is that you're keeping people in a vice. You're keeping people in that trauma state, and justifying it by saying that we need to maintain ourselves in a trauma mentality, in a trauma, emotional state, because that does, that honors our generations and our ancestors who went through the trauma. It's like, no, they went through that so we didn't have to go through this. That was the goal. If we're still experiencing this, even though it's over and they solved the problem, then technically we're dishonoring their memory by being traumatized and staying traumatized because, my great-grandfather suffered for me. And, then what is the point? But ultimately, that's not really a choice on their part or anybody's part, because we don't know we're doing it. It's an automatic reaction. So you have a bunch of people coming out of the military traumatized with that mindset, with that automatic reaction. We think of in the 50s, like, the 50s was the golden age because we had money and we had all these inventions, and there was the birth of the middle class, and normal people with normal jobs could save up and do things they normally couldn't do, and that's great. But there was also a lot of domestic abuse that no one talked about, and a bunch of other things. A lot of these men had PTSD before we realized what PTSD was. In World War I, they called it shell shock, and we're lashing out and explosive, and we're being violent and aggressive with no control over it. Maybe some of them did, but I come from a compassionate psychological standpoint. I know what it is to have mental health and to have behaviors I don't have control over. I emit these behaviors without even wanting to. So I always err on the side of compassion and non-judgment. Not to excuse the behavior, but to acknowledge that it is a complicated issue, that is not just one answer solves everything. So you had a lot of these men exploding and reacting, and you have a lot of women who also equally went, just being a woman is rough, I can imagine. But also, the women were responsible for taking care of everything while the men were at war. Like, they built the economy, they built the weapons, they built everything, you know, Rivet Rosie. And that must have been also an equally traumatic experience on top of everything else women had to go through. So you have these people basically exploding and lashing out and getting triggered and sneezing their trauma onto their children. Intentionally or not intentionally, it's what happened. In a lot of cases, it isn't, because trauma is automatic. That is why it's the word trigger. The individual is not choosing to experience this way. Their nervous system just got reminded that snap, and then I don't know what came over me. I just, you know? So then that generation gets traumatized. And in a sense, with even less context. And that's just the way things are. I don't know why this is happening. I don't know why it's just normal. And for me to accept the fact that it's not normal is too painful for me to deal with and sit with, so I'm just going to tell myself it's normal and you have to do it because I said so. And it goes throughout the ages. Until the pendulum swings the other direction, and you have a generation who finally can sit with themselves and honor what our ancestors sacrificed, but choose otherwise. Choose, I'm not going to be traumatized. I'm not going to sneeze on other people. I'm going to sit with the uncomfortable feelings within myself so that the next generation doesn't have to. Because you're not supposed to suffer. It's not normal for you to be ashamed of yourself, for you to hate yourself, for you to feel guilty and doubt and question every single millimeter of your existence. It's not normal for you to hate everything around you and everyone around you and to constantly be angry and stressed and sad and grieving all the time. These are unhealthy things. These are a nervous system out of balance. This isn't normal. On the grand scheme of things, when we zoom out, which is what I'm interested in with this video, as with all the other work I will do in my life, is zooming out to this grand scale of different generations and the trauma cycling through it all, and recognizing that this isn't the way things are. This isn't the way things have to be, and that this is normal, and that this is for the greater good. This is an illness that has infected our species, our culture, our beautiful planet. And it's not undefeatable. And it's not permanent. It doesn't have to be this way. As with any illness, there is a cure. As with any illness, there is a medicine. And it is a medicine we all have to come together and do. And for me personally, I believe a large part of that work is around the concepts and the emotions of shaming and blaming. I borrow this from the Extinction Rebellion movement. I remember when they said it, and it just made absolute sense to me, that if we truly want to solve a problem, we have to sit with it without judgment, without shame, without trying to decide whose fault it is, and just accept the reality of the situation it is. Because the ship is sinking. It doesn't matter whose fault it is or who blew up the hull. All that matters is that if we don't want to sink, we have to solve it. And we have to think of what actually will solve it. Not what we want to think will solve it, not what makes us feel better, not what, shutting ourselves in the room and pretending that the ship isn't sinking. Accepting the truth as it is and feeling the uncomfortable feelings. And knowing that you won't be alone to do that. That there are other people doing this with you, and that they will reach out and want to do this with you. Ultimately, this reality is a tapestry, and it needs all our threads to make it work. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being you.